If you're here as a Peterson fan, hi, welcome. I recommend you skip to the timestamp on screen. This little opening bit where I wrap up the questionable life lessons that you can take from the rule that we've been talking about is something that's been historically divisive, especially for Peterson fans. So consider this your content warning for something that has historically offended the lobster army. Okay? Okay. Let us now commence with the questionable life advice and other tidbits from Rule 9. Assume the person that you're listening to knows something that you don't. And first, Peterson likes to overshare about his former clients. And I, for one, am glad that he's not actively treating clients right now. The crowd is often correct. As such, do what the crowd's doing. Also, have some gratitude to your culture because you are privileged after all, so don't go rocking the boat. Freud was a genius because people still hate him. And when you're talking with somebody, summarize what they said to you back to them before continuing on. Ooh, a little subversion to the way these things typically go. I guess this section wasn't half bad. There are many types of conversation, and Peterson is a comedic edgelord. Finally, a deep, meaningful conversation that will be thoroughly defined-ish later can be life-changing. Alright, let's see about all that, shall we? This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Welcome back to the channel, or if you're new here, hi! Let's breeze through this introductory content so we can get to the meat of the video sooner. If you are new, I have a cognitive psychology PhD, which is one of the experimental branches of psychology, which puts us in not squishy territory. The squishy territory is taken up by counseling and clinical psychology. And Peterson's PhD is in clinical psychology, so we're in separate fields within psychology. And one way to think of this is the not squishy stuff, we're running experiments. So in my program, we did experiments on learning, attention, visual stuff, memory, cognitive processes, ran students through experiments, and tried to figure out basic cognitive mechanisms. Counseling and clinical psychology, the squishy psychology, are more focused on helping people, helping them with their day-to-day problems, psychological disorders, contributing to society in a not basic science way. So that's sort of where the two of us are coming from. I use a visual shorthand to indicate the sources of thought in this video. This indicates that I'm paraphrasing the book, and this indicates I'm responding to what's in the book. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's find out how we should really talk to others. Lest we get confused, Peterson starts this section by talking about what is roughly amounting to the Venn diagram between thinking and talking. In the previous sections in this chapter, he put forward that true thinking is listening to yourself and requires an inner dialogue between opposing views. This also included the assertion that if you aren't good at thinking, you need to talk to someone else. Part of the clarification now is that not all talking is thinking. So I guess that puts thinking by way of talking as a subset of all talking. Specific to what we covered in part 3, Peterson also clarifies that not all listening will be done with the intent of helping the other person think or grow. The variable here is the motivation behind the communicators. Heads up, we will spend this section going through Peterson's classification of talking. Side note before we get out into the weeds of this section, there's no citations in this section, anywhere. So it's probably safe to assume that these are Peterson's own observations on how conversations tend to go, not anything based in empirical analysis. Also, I'm not a linguist or someone who has studied the cognitive aspects of language, so most of this section is going to be Peterson's conversation taxonomy, seemingly based from his own experiences, versus my personal experiences. At least I can admit it. I bring this up at the start because were I to throw a citation needed on every assertion made in this section, my Premiere file would have an obscene number of video tracks, and I'm rather fond of my computer not being on fire. For completeness, I'm going to include the other types of talking that were earlier in this chapter but won't be in this video. So type 1 is talking as thinking, type 2 is talking with an active listener, and now type 3 is, surprise, dominance hierarchy related.
One person begins by telling an interesting story. The other person, now concerned with his or her potentially substandard status as less interesting individual, immediately thinks of something better, worse, or more surprising to relate. This isn't one of those situations where two conversational participants are genuinely playing off each other, riffing on the same themes for the mutual enjoyment of both and everyone else. This is jockeying for position, pure and simple.
I don't deny these types of conversations happen. Some people have a tendency to try to one-up other people on things. And maybe for some of those people, it's even due to some social dominance drive in their head. But as I've said so often before in these videos, to categorically say that this is the reason behind the sometimes absurd one-upping that can happen is likely oversimplifying things to fit his world model. In reading stories from people who had to break themselves of this tendency, it seems like a more common theme was insecurity, not dominance. They were worried that they had to be as interesting as the people they were talking to, so would try to pull up something as interesting, possibly more interesting, so that they wouldn't be seen as boring. Maybe Peterson would say that the insecurity is related to the hierarchy ranks, but I don't buy it without support. There's also people who need to be at the center of the conversation, and I don't think this need hinges so much on the social dominance, pecking order, whatever, as it does on the person just being kind of immature and selfish. Little selfish shellfish. Peterson says that the identifier for this type of conversation is that
they are accompanied by a feeling of embarrassment among speakers and alike, all who know that something false and exaggerated has just been said.
First, in my experience with someone doing this, I don't tend to feel embarrassment so much as annoyance. Although if it's obvious that the person's being driven by insecurity, I'll probably feel embarrassed for them. Part of the annoyance is on the level of why did they think we'd think this story was true? But another part, for me at least, is the seemingly selfish nature of the person who's trying to monopolize the conversation, and that just drives me up the wall. Second, I want to point out that the difference between riffing and one-upping can be a fine line. Sometimes you have a crazier story to share that you were reminded of by what the other person said. And that crazier story can be shared to the enjoyment of all. Maybe the difference is in framing? If you try to steal the conversation spotlight and make everything about you, you might very well be trying to establish yourself as the most interesting person in the room, and that may make other people feel uncomfortable. But for the chronic liar in my life who has a tendency to do this, I doubt they've ever felt embarrassed monopolizing the conversation. But if you preface your story with something like, wow, that's amazing, sad, whatever the appropriate response is, that totally reminds me of a time when this thing happened to me, it can let you share your story without necessarily feeling like you're one-upping the other person. This distinction or flavor of advice is not included in the text though. Just the description of one-upping bad. The fourth form of conversation is argued to be related to the third.
Neither speaker is listening in the least to the other. Instead, each is using the time occupied by the current speaker to conjure up what he or she will say next, which will often be something off-topic because the person anxiously waiting to speak has not been listening. This can and will bring the whole conversation train to a shuddering halt. At this point, it is usual for those who are on board during the crash to remain silent and look occasionally and in a somewhat embarrassed manner at each other until everyone leaves or someone thinks of something witty and puts Humpty Dumpty together again.
Yes, this does happen sometimes. One-upsmanship doesn't have to occur alone. And in my experience, when it becomes apparent that you have a couple people vying for that most interesting story, the conversation doesn't end in flames. If anything, it becomes incredibly entertaining for the people who are now onlookers. And I have to admit that when this is happening, I tend to lose my annoyance and just sit back and spectate. In the moment of these conversations, the people engaged in this probably don't have the self-awareness to be embarrassed. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be doing what they're doing. They may be embarrassed later, but apparently not then. But again, this is my impression of these sorts of conversations. Final thing here, which is an absolute nitpick, I admit. But I finally have confirmation of a hunch thanks to the Rise of Peterson documentary. In Peterson's writing style, the hypothetical people being talked about are typically he, sometimes he or she, and in rare cases, just she. It would simplify things so much if he could just bring himself to use they instead of he or she over and over. but I suspect that he won't let himself use they in this manner because that would go against his fundamental categories of male or female. And he's trying to save the world after all. Clunky writing be damned. The next conversation type is also dominance related, but now centered on ideology.
During such a conversation, which often tends toward the ideological, the speaker endeavors to 1. Denigrate or ridicule the viewpoint of anyone holding a contrary position. 2. Use selective evidence while doing so. And, finally, 3. Impress the listeners, many of whom are already occupying the same ideological space, with the validity of his assertions. The goal is to gain support for a comprehensive, unitary, oversimplified worldview.
Peterson would know all about this conversation type, wouldn't he?
Thus, the purpose of the conversation is to make the case that not thinking is the correct track. The person who is speaking in this manner believes that winning the argument makes him right, and that doing so necessarily validates the assumption structure of the dominance hierarchy he most identifies with.
So it's sort of like beating a dead horse at this point, but this is a part of the video where I pull up old quotes from the book of him essentially saying this. Maybe you'll remember way back in Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, this choice quote, where Peterson instructed us not to think. Or maybe the time in Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, where we were told to not question our beliefs. Yeah. The unintentional autobiography continues.
This is often, and unsurprisingly, the hierarchy within which he has achieved the most success, or the one with which he is most temperamentally aligned.
Totally unrelated. Completely. But if you didn't watch my review and commentary on the Peterson documentary, you should check that out at some point. The documentary, being called The Rise of Jordan Peterson, is completely unrelated to the point here of achieving success in certain hierarchies.
Almost all discussions involving politics or economics unfold in this manner, with each participant attempting to justify fixed, a priori positions instead of trying to learn something or to adopt a different frame, even for the novelty. It is for this reason that conservatives and liberals alike believe their positions to be self-evident, particularly as they become more extreme. Given certain temperamentally based assumptions, a predictable conclusion emerges, but only when you ignore the fact that assumptions themselves are mutable.
As I said in the intro to the Peterson documentary, I can't stop linking things back to it. Case in point, Peterson thinks of himself as a centrist. A couple colleagues of his, former or current, also indicate that he can't see that he himself is doing what he accuses the left and right of. A la this quote. Moving on. Peterson stops the conversation categorization to clarify how these dominance-related conversations are different from those where people listen.
When a genuine listening conversation is taking place, one person at a time has the floor, and everyone else is listening.
Is there a talking stick to pass around, indicating who gets to talk? Sorry, sort of. I'll let him continue.
The person speaking is granted the opportunity to seriously discuss some event, usually unhappy or even tragic. Everyone else responds sympathetically.
This sounds more like a support group than a conversation. And I'm not throwing shade here at support groups. Those can be very helpful in people figuring out how to deal with stuff. But conversations, genuine conversations, can happen without having this quality. While it's nice that Peterson's sort of using more than two boxes here, it seems like he doesn't allow for a conversation to have more than one form. It's gotta fit one type. No more, no less. You think you're having a genuine conversation where all parties are listening, but it's not about something unhappy or tragic? Too bad, bucko, you're not. You only thought you were. Final comment before continuing on with the listening conversations. Speaking as someone who tends to be somewhat introverted and doesn't really like talking over other people, having this sort of dynamic where all parties get to share their thoughts freely would be great, but that's not how it goes. I don't know how many times I've been in a group conversation and we're talking about something, and I have something I'd like to add, but by the time there's enough of a lull for me to comfortably add it, we've moved on to a different topic. And yeah, I've been the socially awkward penguin a couple times and tried to loop the conversation back to what we were talking about, but I pretty much feel like a tool doing that. So I've learned that I either need to be more forceful in getting my idea out and maybe talk over somebody a little bit, or to let it go. So yeah, a speaking stick would be nice, but then you would lose the sort of dynamic nature of conversations.
These conversations are important because the speaker is organizing the troublesome events in his or her mind while recounting the story. The fact is important enough to bear repeating. People organize their brains with conversation. If they don't have anyone to tell their story to, they lose their minds. Like hoarders, they cannot unclutter themselves. The input of the community is required for the integrity of the individual psyche. To put it another way, it takes a village to organize a mind.
See what I mean about the support group vibe? Second, repeating something that wasn't substantiated the first time doesn't make it any more true the second. Also, if this was the case, surely he would have no shortage of references to back this claim up. Peterson continues on with this train of outsourcing thought.
Much of what we consider healthy mental function is the result of our ability to use the reactions of others to keep our complex selves functional. We outsource the problems of our sanity.
What? While our understanding and definition of what constitutes normal or abnormal behavior is contingent on societal norms, I think it's a stretch to say that mental health stuff is reliant on other people to steer us sane. But it seems that Peterson, a clinical psychologist who used to have clients, would either throw out or ignore the genetic component behind some of the psychological disorders. Breaking the segregation between summary and response to say that Peterson immediately follows this outsourcing sanity idea up with a callback to the parenting chapter, saying that it's up to the parents to make their kids socially acceptable. OMG. I guess it's my parents' fault that I have bipolar and its friend disorders because they weren't spanky enough when I was a kid. Peterson then claims that a lot of social policing happens during conversations, with what amounts to operant conditioning keeping us in line with what's acceptable. In genuine conversation, the person sharing their problem gets validation. This then becomes a men are from Mars, women are from Venus type of discussion.
Men and women often misunderstand each other when these conversations are focused on a specific problem. Men are often accused of wanting to fix things too early on in a discussion. This frustrates men who like to solve problems and to do it efficiently, and who are in fact called upon frequently by women for precisely that purpose. It might be easier for my male readers to understand why this does not work. However, if they could realize and then remember that before a problem can be solved, it must be formulated precisely.
This gets worse, but I want to jump in to say that it's not just men who like to solve problems. Jesus fucking Christ. I'll add more when we're done with this thought.
Women are often intent on formulating the problem when they are discussing something, and they need to be listened to, even questioned, to help ensure clarity in the formulation. Then, whatever problem is left, if any, can be helpfully solved. It should also be noted first that too early problem solving may also merely indicate a desire to escape from the effort of the problem formulating conversation.
When you link this back to the earlier parts of the chapter, with people needing to have some degree of sophistication in order to really think on their own, there's the implication, intended or not, that women aren't sophisticated thinkers. Thanks. As I brought up earlier in the chapter, it can be useful to bounce ideas off of other people. Problems are no exception to this. For men, women, or those who lie betwixt. The most helpful piece of advice I've seen related to this is not for men to patiently wait until the woman has said enough so it doesn't look like they're trying to bail on emotional labor before fixing it. No matter the gender of the parties involved, the advice is to ask if you're on the listening end, or specify if you're on the talking end, what sort of conversation you're hoping to have. Sometimes people just need to vent, and if the person needs to vent, trying to help them solve the problem probably isn't going to be wanted or appreciated. However, sometimes they are asking for help on how to solve a problem or a different perspective or whatever, and in that case, by all means, help them solve that problem. Knowing up front what sort of conversation this is going to be can help disambiguate so much of what Peterson is talking about here. Back to the conversation types. The sixth type is the lecture. And Peterson says that this isn't just a one-way flow of information because there's a back and forth with the audience.
A good lecturer is not only delivering facts, which is perhaps the least important part of a lecture, but also telling stories about those facts, pitching them precisely to the level of the audience's comprehension, gauging that by the interest they are showing. The story he or she is telling conveys to the members of the audience not only what the facts are, but why they are relevant. Why it is important to know certain things about which they are currently ignorant.
Facts are the least important part of a lecture. What? What? In my teaching experience, having stories or anecdotes can help reinforce the concept I'm trying to get across. Reinforce. It also lets students have some extra time to write down notes and stuff, but it's mostly about providing extra retrieval cues for later recall. Also, framing the audience as ignorant is kind of unhelpful. This is absolutely pedantic because this is well within the definition of ignorant, but when I was teaching, I found it so much more useful to think of my students as not yet having the understanding or knowledge, not ignorant.
To demonstrate the importance of some set of facts is to tell the audience members how such knowledge could change their behavior, or influence the way they interpret the world, so that they will now be able to avoid some obstacles and progress more rapidly to some better goals.
To go back to the dead horse a little, in Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie, Peterson said some kind of clashing things with what he's saying here. Basically, influencing other people bad, except when you're lecturing, I guess. Then there's a little aside or rant about how to lecture correctly. He says instead of lecturing to the group, you lecture to individuals within the group. And what this means is you're making eye contact and getting a response from one person before moving on to another individual and seeing that they're okay, and moving on and just rotating between people within the group. This sort of lecturing style always made me uncomfortable, on both ends. As a student, if I figured out the professor was this sort of lecturer, I would sit as far back as I could and never look up for anything, because I can't do that prolonged eye contact. It's too much for me. On the teaching end, I didn't tend to anchor on students. If somebody was smiling at me, okay, I'll look at their face, but for the most part, it was just a vague sea of faces, and that's how I dealt with it. The seventh type of conversations are wit measuring contests.
These also have a dominance element, but the goal is to be the most entertaining speaker, which is an accomplishment that everyone participating will also enjoy. The purpose of these conversations, as a witty friend once observed, was to say anything that was either true or funny. I think that this might be the intelligent blue workers' conversation. Albertans and Navy SEALs I've known were all perfectly happy to say anything, no matter how appalling, as long as it was funny.
We're going to complete this thought before I jump in. His example here is of one of the SEALs' jokes about I bought non-refundable tickets to a friend's birthday party when he found out that that friend's wife needed brain surgery.
I retold the story recently to a group of newer acquaintances, and they were more shocked and appalled than amused. I tried to defend the joke as an indication of the SEAL's respect for the couple's ability to withstand and transcend tragedy, but I wasn't particularly successful. His joke was daring, anarchic to the point of recklessness, which is exactly the point where serious funny occurs. My friend and his wife recognized the compliment. They saw that their friend knew they were tough enough to withstand that level of, well, let's call it competitive humor. It was a test of character, which they passed with flying colors.
Peterson ends this section by noting that these types of wit conversations happen less and less frequently as he moved from university to university and up the educational and social ladder. He speculates that this is partially a function of class and also a function of the nature of mature friendships, because his childhood friends are able to still just keep him in stitches. Okay, response time for this type of conversation. This whole thing reads like such a backhanded compliment for tradespeople. On the one hand, he's saying this tends to be more common among blue-collar workers. On the other, there's that little clarifier of intelligent blue-collar workers, plus the indication that these people are lower down the hierarchy than the more educated. Oh no. Is this why I had a Peterson fan apologizing for not being more educated in a YouTube comment? Maybe it's just the people I know, but there is a time, place, and context for when this type of conversation is appropriate. I have had countless games of Cards Against Humanity with left and right-leaning people that have been inappropriately hilarious. Sometimes the best way to deal with the shit-tastic state of the world is to laugh at it. But a lot of the memorable moments are best left in that context. Trying to retell it later to somebody who wasn't there or isn't familiar with the game, it's probably going to fall flat. And having to basically say, oh, you had to be there to get it, is a pretty good indicator that that joke just isn't going to work to people outside of that context. This class distinction will come up again in the Let Kids Skateboard chapter, but Peterson apparently thinks that academics are a stuffy, unfunny bunch. And yeah, some can be, but lots of people from lots of different walks of life can't take a joke. It's not just those higher up the educational ladder. I think maybe the point here isn't necessarily that blue-collar workers are more funny and are more willing to break political correctness to make a joke, so much as there has to be a certain level of trust and a form of intimacy in order to do these types of jokes. The threshold for how much trust is required certainly varies between people, though. The first thing that my mother-in-law said to me first time I met her when I was dating my now husband was, "Have you seen my pussy?" Context: she was looking for her cat. And maybe on some level it was a test of character as Peterson claims, but on another, that's just her sense of humor. She does it to everyone. She likes to mess with people. And personally, I'm more inclined to get to know the person and test the waters first before unleashing the full inappropriate humor section in my brain. I will concede, though, that there may be an environmental factor that differs between the work environments. Hard, physical labor is a different beast than sitting in front of a computer all day in a cubicle. But this is something that will be explored more in the skateboarding chapter. I also can't deny the, what's the right word, paranoia that's taken over some parts of the left. It seems like some people are so afraid of bad actors coming in and infiltrating the discourse that they are constantly on guard for any transgressions that may indicate a mask slip. At some point, there was a shift from trying to do our best and accommodate people by not using hurtful words to canceling people who make mistakes. The comedian Patton Oswalt has a good bit along these lines at one point, but to not tempt fate, I'll include a link in the description to it. The eighth type of conversation is, to borrow Peterson's verbiage from other places, the most sophisticated.
The final type of conversation, akin to listening, is a form of mutual exploration. It requires true reciprocity on the part of those listening and speaking. It allows all participants to express and organize their thoughts. A conversation of mutual exploration is a topic, generally complex, of genuine interest to participants. Everyone participating is trying to solve a problem, instead of insisting on the a priori validity of their own positions. All are acting on the premise that they have something to learn. This kind of conversation constitutes active philosophy, the highest form of thought, and the best preparation for proper living.
A note before continuing. We're in the final leg of the wrap-up, so you know that the U directives and style madness are going to be fully unleashed at this point. Features of this type of conversation. Ideas must be related to the person's aims and percepts. Really? Ideas must be lived truths. Really? And in these conversations, you have to embrace the chaotic unknown instead of the other conversation types where you're staying safely in order. Really?
You already know what you know after all, and unless your life is perfect, what you know is not enough. You remain threatened by disease and self-deception and unhappiness and malevolence and betrayal and corruption and pain and limitation. You are subject to all these things in the final analysis because you are just too ignorant to protect yourself.
On some level, I agree that assuming you don't know everything is a good stance to have. Stay curious about the world. But the consistent framing of doom and despair, I mean, shit, I've got bipolar, so I can cycle into some pretty bleak mindsets, but even I'm calling this a bit much. I don't think having more knowledge is going to improve your vulnerability to disease, unless we're talking a couple hundred years ago and basic biology. Plus, there's the issue of what exactly he means by knowledge. It and related words are tossed around a bit here, but their intended meaning isn't nailed down. Surprise! And final analysis is never going to not sound ominous or threatening to me.
If you just knew enough, you could be healthier and more honest. You would suffer less. You could recognize, resist, and even triumph over malevolence and evil. You would neither betray a friend, nor deal falsely and deceitfully in business, politics, or love. However, Your current knowledge has neither made you perfect nor kept you safe. So, it is insufficient by definition. Radically, fatally insufficient.
He's once again claiming that if you follow his rules, your life will be drastically improved. But the thing about malevolence and evil is that they can come out of nowhere. That's part of why it's so scary. Living life involves some acceptance of risk that a random evil motherfucker out there could just end your life on a whim. And there's the freak accidents and just the universe rolling a 1 in your favor. Like, bad things happen and sometimes people die from that. Knowledge can help mitigate some of those risks, but it can't do away with them altogether. And holding perfection as a comparison point would seem to go against his former rule of comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Perfect is the enemy of good. Coincidentally, that ends up being my mantra roughly every Thursday in editing.
You must accept this before you can converse philosophically, instead of convincing, oppressing, dominating, or even amusing. You must accept this before you can tolerate a conversation where the word that eternally mediates between order and chaos is operating, psychologically speaking.
I've been rereading this page, trying to contextualize what he means by that first this. I think this is that your knowledge is insufficient. Also, there's that word again, with a capital W, so important for being with a capital B. The style madness that permeates this last section almost makes sense in this chapter. No easier way to drive home the point that the reader doesn't know enough than to confuse them with vague language.
To have this kind of conversation, it is necessary to respect the personal experience of your conversational partners. You must assume that they have reached careful, thoughtful, genuine conclusions, and perhaps they must have done the work that justifies this assumption.
Oh really, Dr. Peterson? Do you think you do this when you talk to trans people? Although, I would guess that he would label those sorts of conversations as being ideologically driven instead, or something, so he wouldn't have to assume the person he's speaking to has a valid experience. Convenient. There's some ideas about learning from the other person's shared experiences, or listening with an open mind, and then an idea so profound it needed to be italicized.
It's as if you were listening to yourself during such a conversation, just as you were listening to the other person. You are describing how you are responding to the new information imparted by the speaker. You are reporting what that information has done to you, what new things it made appear within you, how it has changed your presuppositions, how it has made you think of new questions. You tell the speaker these things directly, then they have the same effect on him. In this manner, you both move towards something newer and broader and better. You both change as you let your old presuppositions die, as you shed your skins and emerge renewed.
This reads more like a description of a shared hallucinogenic experience than a conversation. It's unfortunate that explanatory examples go out the window when we hit the wrap-up section, because it would be really helpful to have any sort of concrete clarification on what he means by this. Model a sophisticated conversation for us, daddy. I wish I could paraphrase more of this. I'm going to let the style madness run rampant for a little bit, but before I do, I just want to echo something I've said before. Opening yourself up to growth is typically a good thing. It doesn't have to be couched in this grandiose language, though.
A conversation such as this is one where it is the desire for truth itself, on the part of both participants, that is truly listening and speaking. That's why it's engaging, vital, interesting, and meaningful. That sense of meaning is a signal from the deep, ancient parts of your being. You're where you should be, with one foot in order, and the other tentatively extended into chaos and the unknown. You're immersed in the Tao, following the great way of life. There, you're stable enough to be secure, but flexible enough to transform. There, you're allowing new information to inform you, to permeate your stability, to repair and improve its structure and expand its domain. There, the constituent elements of your being can find their more elegant formation. A conversation like that puts you in the realm where souls connect, and that's a real place. The masks come off, and the searchers were revealed.
Yup. It happened again. The Lovecraftian creature within Peterson was set loose upon the keyboard, and I really don't know what to say other than, there you go. That happened. Loaded with facts. And, as is tradition, this creature gets reined in a little bit for this final conclusion.
So listen to yourself and to those with whom you are speaking. Your wisdom then consists not of the knowledge you already have, but the continual search for knowledge, which is the highest form of wisdom. It is for this reason that the priestess of the Delphic oracle in ancient Greece spoke most highly of Socrates, who always sought the truth. She described him as the highest living man because he knew that what he knew was nothing. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't.
I joked about hallucinogens earlier, but you know who was likely high off her tits? The Oracle. This Socrates being the wisest thing was discussed in Rule 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, Part 2. Since that was a while ago, let me recap the relevant part. Peterson's using one source, Xenophon, for Socrates' life going into his trial, but Plato provides a somewhat different account. In that chapter, Peterson's emphasis was on Socrates' divine sign, which was a thing inside him that basically told him not to do things that it didn't like. The wisest of all men part wasn't explored by Peterson beyond that divine sign. In Plato's versions of events, Socrates didn't want to believe the oracle that he was the wisest, so he set about trying to find someone wiser. But in questioning, harassing, the people of Athens, he found that the wisdom he encountered would fall apart with some poking. Socrates' conclusion was then said to be that he was only the wisest because he was aware of his own ignorance. So no, Peterson, from the evidence we have, the oracle didn't say that. Also, where's your references? You had tons of references for this back in Rule 6. Where are they now? Let's see if we can get some more positive life advice out of this chapter. Advice is okay. Yes, it's a different thing from psychotherapy, but that doesn't mean people offering advice or doing it with ill intent. Contrary to what Peterson says, it's probably fair to say that people think. Just because people think differently than you do isn't inherently a bad thing. Also, going along with the crowd isn't always good advice. You have to use your judgment if it's the best thing for you to be doing. Culture of our ancestors be damned. You know yourself better than others, especially if that other is someone like Peterson. It's okay to take the good parts of your culture and not take the negative parts. It's even okay to try to change things for the better. It's also okay to outsource your thinking when you need help. It's not a sign of an unsophisticated mind. Freud being allegedly hated doesn't make him correct. If that logic worked, someone like Hitler would be very correct. I will agree with Peterson's point that it's generally a good idea to try to get along with other people, within reason. Don't risk your safety to do so. Actively listening to the person you're talking to is a useful skill to have. I agree. I don't think breaking down the different types of conversation is helpful on a day-to-day basis. Don't worry about categorizing the type of conversation you're having with someone just to know how to respond most efficiently. Just talk with people. I don't understand why this has to be so complicated. Deep, stimulating conversations are magical when they happen, but in my experience, they tend to happen organically and don't have to be about profound philosophical topics. Sitting down with the intent to have one seems doomed from the outset, at least in our normal surroundings and not in a debate or interview setting. At the end of this, the take-home message I would suggest is listen to people. They may know something that you don't, and they may also have a different perspective from your own. And their perspective may be in direct opposition to your own, and for a lot of things, that's okay. We don't all have to agree with each other on everything. If we did, life would be incredibly boring. Alrighty, that's it for this chapter. YouTube invocation. Like, comment, subscribe if you haven't. You can also find me on Twitter, my Discord server, or on Patreon, where all the shiny things go. Links for those are in the description box, and yeah, see you guys in the next video. Bye!